Red Dragon, Blue Dragon is a war game that comes with issue 45 of the Against the Odds magazine, a journal of history and simulation. It's a very good magazine that I enjoy reading every time that I get a copy. And I'm traveling these days, I'm traveling to Italy. So when you're traveling, magazine games are just perfect because they pack light, they travel well, and they come with a magazine, so you also have something to read on the flight. So I read the magazine, very good read as usual, and I played the game Red Dragon, Blue Dragon. Here you see the map. As for the content, it is a game about the American Civil War. The American Civil War? I got tricked by reading that. About that. The campaign is called China's Gettysburg. The Chinese Civil War, in particular the Huaihai campaign 48-49, with the campaign where the People's Liberation Army, which I will call PLA in this review, pretty much defeated the Kuomintang, GMD. They forced them to, they drove them out of mainland China and they forced them to move to Taiwan. So a particularly important campaign that has resonance even today. I mean, the consequences are still very important. And the Chinese Civil War is not a theater of operations that has been explored in many war games. So it is always nice to have a game which is not about one of the most conventional topics, one of those topics that we see a lot of times in wargaming. So it's also a game that gave me the opportunity to learn about a campaign that I did not know much about. Now, as for the general idea here you see the area around the city of Suzhou, and that is clearly the main area of operations. The map, the printed map, the piece of paper is pretty big. The playable area is much smaller, so you have a lot of empty space around it. Of course, you have the turn track here, you have other tracks here, but it's an overall small playable area, but it's not a bad thing per se. It's compact thing, it keeps things tight. The players represent, as we said, the PLA, represented by red pieces, the Red Dragon, and then we have the GMT, the Kuomintang blue game pieces. Game pieces are mainly infantry units. We have some cavalry, some tanks. We have artillery that has a supporting role. I really much like artillery that in combat, when supporting an attack, rolls a die, you roll a d6, and that is the number of combat factors that the artillery unit adds to the fight. So it's not a fixed number, you do not know exactly how much damage the unit will be able to inflict. We have leaders for both sides, and there are a couple of extra fairly, I must say, fiddly rules about leaders. So leaders grant different benefits to the two sides. Of course, we have PLA and GMD leaders. The problem is that the leaders of the two sides work in different ways, and within each side then you have leaders that have specific unique abilities. This is a trait of this design. Every rule has a sub-rule, every sub-rule is an exception to that sub-rule, and that exception has exceptions and lead to other sub-rules. It's a very detailed design, but with a lot of exceptions, so that means a little bits and pieces that you have to memorize, and things get a little Byzantine from time to time. We're talking about available units. Also, the GMD can rely on air supports. They can be used to support combat, in which case they work as artillery units in the sense that you roll a die to see how much they contribute to the fight. So one of the air units also adds +1 to the die roll that you use to resolve combat, and air units can also be used for interdiction, that is to slow down enemy movement. At the beginning of the game, the map will look quite cluttered. There are a lot of units on the map already, and then more units enter the fight later. And the GMD is defending in the central area of the map. They have a lot of units lined up on this railroad here, this white line here. A lot of units lined up there with a stack of units defending in there, and then a smaller number of units defending here. The PLA is coming in two ways, one from this area and one from that edge, so they're kind of like smashing them between two lines. The the GMD needs to prevent the two lines of enemy units from sandwiching them and then just smashing them from two sides. Also, tricky things when it comes to the map, or the organization of the map for the GMD, is that the GMD has stricter supply rules than the PLA. The PLA can trace winding paths of any length as long as those paths lead to this edge here or that edge there to receive supplies. You need to have a line of supply no matter how complicated, as long as, of course, it doesn't go through impassable X's or X sites or enemy units. So that's pretty free, pretty flexible system of supplies. The problem for the GMD is actually they have to rely on railroads and roads. They can trace only a line of no more than 2 hexes, that is one intervening next to a railroad or a road, and then they need that road or railroad to go to the southern edge. So as you can see, there are bottlenecks here. So if the PLA takes control of this area here and this area here, they exploit 2 geographical bottlenecks in the net of supplies for the GMD player, and that creates pretty disastrous effects, because auto-supply GMD units, well, auto-supply units in this game have a penalty of movement and combat with their values halved, and you check supplies when a unit moves and when a unit is involved in combat. Also, there are other negative effects that can be triggered for auto-supply GMD units. So there is that. Supplies are important. Now, as for the structure of a turn starts with random effects, a random effect that is in play for the turn, and that is rolled on this table here, the China News table. You roll to the 6 and you apply the effect. And sometimes after you roll, then you roll again, and then you roll again, and then you roll again. There are strings of rolls sometimes. Also, there may be no events, but it's interesting, like in many games that have this sort of things, to have that extra level of chrome and unpredictability that you can have from ammunition issues, moral crisis, and so on and so forth. Interesting stuff. But also some extra rules that may come from there. The weather, you check the weather, or you follow the weather printed on the turn track. If you decide to use the historical weather, then each turn tells you what the weather was historically, or you roll if you decide to use optional variable weather. And the weather can be good, everything is fine, can be bad weather, then of course that influences movement, and also air combat or air support, or you can have thaw, which affects movement on the map but does not impede flights, does not prevent the GMD air forces from helping their land units. Then the interesting sequence here, well, you have movement and combat, but the way it works, the order movement and combat phases alternate, as that first the GMD player moves, then the PLA player moves, then the PLA attacks, then the GMD player attacks. So it's a different sequence from what you have usually, movement, combat, and that takes into account the advantages of the PLA in terms of flexibility, maneuverability, mobility. They are more effective. The GMD has a much stronger army with more resources, so with stronger weapons and everything like that. They have the raw strength, but logistically speaking, the PLA has a mobility that allows them to do a lot more things. Another thing is that GMD has low morale, so actually another rule that you find in the long lists of small rules that you have in the game is that there are many circumstances when the GMD player needs to take a loyalty check. Then you roll on this table here from this player 8 here, is the opposite, also on the opposite side of the random events. Then you check the loyalty table, you roll, you apply modifiers, you pass if you are within the indicated range, depending on the type of unit, but a 1 is always a pass, but a 6 or going out of this range is always a fail. If the unit fails, allows it defects to the other side to represent the low morale of the GMD fighters at that point. And here there's not one, but there are two procedures to determine what happens to the defectors. So there's a procedure to determine how re-education works, and there's also another way of using the defectors, the Lipu-Lifu procedure. I'll leave it to you if you decide to play the game to discover all of the details and joys of this extremely detailed procedure. My first reaction is like, I like the idea of defectors, I like the idea of switching sides, historically, thematically, but also clearly mechanically, because it adds to the unpredictability of the system, the variety of the action. But do I really need two detailed procedures to handle defecting? You will answer yes, of course, because I know history better than you, and without that, history makes no sense. But game-wise, it feels a little cumbersome. So, remember what we said? Movement, combat, no, movement, combat, combat. PLA movement, GMD movement, PLA combat, GMD combat. During the PLA movement phase also, there's another special rule that may be in play or not that forces the PLA player to perform short attacks, which are not attacks at all really. It's more like they are forced to move next to enemy units and then move away, sort of like to simulate a hit and run, which really is not resolved as combat, by the way, but simply forces the PLA player to move their units in a certain way. In a certain sense, it's like a magnet that gives restrictions to the PLA movement, even though it's called an attack, is described as an attack, it really has an effect on movement mainly. Now, we talked about movement. The two sides, guess what, move in different ways. Well, they both follow the rules that you move units up to their movement allowance, which is the number printed in the bottom right area of the counters. But then the two sides have different ways of moving. For example, the PLA can use force marches, whereas the GND player can rely on convoy movement and railroad movements. They work in different ways, but the general idea is that these types of movements give you extra movement ability. They allow you to move faster, but there are restrictions in the way you interact with the enemy units. In general, when you're using specific movement, extra fast movement, you cannot move adjacent to enemy units. That is, you cannot end your movement adjacent to enemy units. Combat is classic. Actually, this is the most linear element in this game. You can rely on classic concept when it comes to combat. Combat is between adjacent axes. You attack from one axis to the next, and you can pile up combat factors against the opponent. Combat factors of the units is represented by the number in the bottom left area of the unit. You total combat factor of the attacker, adding support that may come from air support and from artillery. You reduce the combat factor of the attacker and that of the opponent to a ratio 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 1 to 2, etc., etc. Again, classic odds system. And you roll on this table here. Well, the odds will tell you the column that you use. To that column, you may have to apply modifiers, shifting the column to the left or to the right, based, for example, on the terrain of the defender, which gives an advantage to the defender and therefore shifts the column to the left. You may have leaders affecting. You may have a modifier to the die roll, depending on the air support that you are receiving. Once you have the column and you roll, apply possible modifiers, you cross-reference the result, and you will find a letter indication that tells you what happens. What happens is probably, most likely, a lot of blood will be spilled. And just look, retreat, that is not the bloodiest, of course, but then you have attrition when a player eliminates a unit. Major battle, attacker and defender both eliminate at least half of the printed combat factor of the defenders. Major battle, disaster, defender eliminates all of participating units, PLA attackers may advance up to 2 axes, etc., etc. Bloodbath, that's quite an enticing title, isn't it? Eliminate all the units of the smaller total combat force. The largest combat force eliminates units whose tally combat factor is at least equal to the smaller total force eliminated. There is no retreat, advance, or pursuit. Everybody's too shocked for that. It's a powerful system, and as I said, it works very well. It's also a pleasure to find something that is linear and predictable and simple in this game. Mind you, there are still a couple of extra units here and there that do special stuff, but at least you can rely on pretty classic concepts here. And then you have a lot of other extra small effects. I said you have leaders to do specific things. There's a concept called final defense positions that is used by the GMD exactly for the last possible defense, and it's a system of rules and sub-rules that allow the player to stack extra units in a hex. You have special rules for assault bridges, for, as I said, short attack tactics, militia, guerrillas, a lot of small extra details. The rulebook is not long, it just feels longer. It's something like 10 pages, and it feels like the rulebook of a much heavier game. Also, another detail I didn't mention, the PLA units following the rules would need to play face down. This is very old school. When a side has hidden units, it's just much more convenient to have blocks, so the blocks will stand up on the board and only face the opponents. But of course, in a game that comes with a magazine, finding blocks is not so usual, so when magazine games use hidden units, usually they do that with the units face down, which is always kind of annoying and of course makes it hard, if not impossible, to play solitaire. I played the game in solitaire, so let me tell you, I simply ignore that rule. I play with all units face up. I still enjoyed it, I still found the game enjoyable, but I lost that fog of war element. But I don't feel like I lost much, really. I still enjoyed the game, the action was still interesting. Oh, as for victory conditions, early on in the game, the PLA player can win an early victory, sudden death victory, by taking control of Suzhou. If that doesn't happen early in the game, then the game continues until the end of turn 10, and victory then is based on the number of units that the GMD player lost. So it is based on how much GMD blood the PLA player is able to spill. As for a general assessment, I liked it. I really enjoyed the opportunity to play a game about a campaign that I didn't know. I was able to learn a lot about the challenges, about the geography, about the human factor, about the moral factor, the political elements. This is a game that does a really good job of weaving history into game mechanics and turn them into a game which is overall playable and presents interesting challenges for both sides. The two sides are completely different from one another. They play very asymmetrically, and you have, again, a side that is stronger, looks stronger on paper, but then everything plays against them. People start defecting, the combat system favors the other side because of pain and suffering being inflicted on one side being what matters for that side to lose the game, because of the desperate defense that the GMD has to put at the beginning, even at the cost of increased losses, and that of course counts against them later when the victory condition changes. The map is interesting. You see all of these rivers and you think, wow, there are some interesting defensive possibilities here. Well, as the GMD player, you will soon realize that the rivers are all facing the wrong direction, because it would be great if the enemies were coming from here and you could constantly retreat behind these rivers, but the enemies are coming from directions that allow them to drive through these rivers, and there are enough bridges to offset part, not all, but part of the defensive advantages of the rivers. At least the rivers allow you to prevent certain maneuvers, but then there are also other empty areas where the GMD player really does not want to go, because the opponent can easily surround them, but again that forces them to defend very close to to the most precious areas. They cannot stretch out too much. So the map presents challenges to the GMD player, the supply system presents challenges. So it's an interesting game, interesting system with the two sides facing completely different sets of challenges and opportunities. The game could be even better though, and probably you have figured out from my description of the general game, of overview of the general mechanics. It could be much better if it was more streamlined. At least for me, I like detail. It just seems to me that here there are just bits of detail, bits of chrome that feels like have been like stacked up one on top of the other. Multi-layered is a good thing. Stacked somehow, which it just feels like they've been piled up. It almost feels like a room that has been cluttered with rules and exceptions and bits of information. There are just too many exceptions, too many sub-rules for me to fully enjoy the game. I don't know, if I'm playing an epic game that covers all of World War II, then I want those rules, I'm okay with the investment. There's a game that somehow seems to be weakened, at least in my perception, my personal opinion, weakened by a level of detail that alas seems to result more in fiddliness than in heightened historical vividness. The picture appears to be blurred by the level of detail rather than magnified, rather than being more accurate. In terms of historical accuracy, again, I don't know enough about the campaign. I'm sure that the designer did a lot of homework. I'm sure that it is accurate, but simply you don't get that strong of a sense, a strong of a feel of the event through the long list of rules and sub-rules as much as you would, I believe, with a more streamlined system. So I think this seems to me one of those cases where the level of detail goes against the overall experience of playing the game rather than in favor. And it may just be a subjective thing. Someone else will say, well, this game without those rules would feel not historical enough, not detailed enough. There certainly is a subjective element, and I don't mind complex games. They're just games where the set of rules somehow seem to be more organically integrated than they are here, where the rules seem to stem one out of the other rather than just to be piled up one on top of the other. To me, that was more the case, that the piling up the rules. I had to go through the procedure several times and I learned them, but they did not go together very organically. Blue Dragon, Red Dragon, it is a good game, and I'm glad the game exists. I'm glad I played it because I was then able to learn about the campaign. It was fun. It was a fun, interesting challenge. It is just a game that I think could have been much better if it had been streamlined a little bit more.